Hi, I'm Jim Hodgson. I'm the Executive Director of the Fort Worth Aviation Museum, and we're going to give you a quick overview here of the aviation history here in North Texas. Starting in 1911, January 12, 1911, a group called the Moisant Aviators were brought here by some of the local businessmen to put on a flight demonstration at what was called the Fort Worth Driving Park. Fort Worth Driving Park was located down off of 7th Street. In fact, in a 1929 photograph of Montgomery Plaza, you can see the track back there. So the first flight took place here. It took place on a very windy day, and an airplane called the Blériot 11, which was an early successful airplane, was flown by this gentleman, whose name is Roland Garros, and he was the first person to fly a powered airplane here in Fort Worth. There were about 17,000 people who were there that day to see that first flight take place. And now, through the work here in the museum, we've established a city park right across the street from where that took place, and we've had a Texas Historic marker put on the site. So it's a commemoration of where aviation started here in Fort Worth. Later that same year, in 1911, William Randolph Hearst, a newspaper publisher in San Francisco, started a contest, and he would pay anybody $50,000 who could fly cross country in 30 days or less. A gentleman named Cal Rogers bought an airplane from the Wright brothers and started out in Sheepshead Bay, New York, and proceeded to fly across country. He was sponsored by Vin Fizz, which was a soft drink out of Chicago, Illinois, and they came and they used railroad tracks and trains to bring supplies and maintenance people along to follow along on the flight. There were no airports, so they were looking for places to land. When he got here to Fort Worth, he landed over in Ryan's pasture, which is over near the site of TCU today. Cal Rogers was the first person to complete the flight all the way, first transcontinental flight all the way to Long Beach. He didn't win the prize, however, because instead of 30 days, it took him close to 60 days to make the flight. He crashed 17 times, and the only part of the airplane that left New York and made it to California was the oil pan from the engine. A couple years later, in 1915, the first Aero Squadron came through Fort Worth en route from Fort Sill going down to Fort Sam Houston. What was significant about that, it was the first time that the entire U.S. Air Force, which consisted of 6 airplanes, did a cross-country flight and transferred bases from one place to the other. This gentleman is Benjamin Filet. He's considered to be the father of the U.S. Air Force. He bought the government bought for him a Wright Flyer back in 1911, and he started flying down at Fort Sam Houston with that airplane. Him and that airplane and an hour and a half of flight instruction from the Wright brothers, and then the rest of it was mail order. But this is a picture that was taken here in Fort Worth. Again, they landed in Ryan's pasture also, and that's the entire United States Air Force in 1915. From 1915, when we got up to 1917 and just prior to the First World War, or the U.S. involvement in the First World War, some of the local businessmen, Benny Keith, Amon Carter Sr., and a number of others, worked with the U.S. government to establish 3 flying fields here around Fort Worth so that the Royal Flying Corps could come down here and conduct flight operations. In exchange for the fields, they also trained 300 American pilots and about 2,500 mechanics that we knew when our involvement started with the First World War, we would have some semblance of an air service. This is a picture of what the airfields looked like at the time. They were all cookie cutters, so they all are essentially the same. Pilots wore goggles like these. One gentleman who trained here and lived here, his name was William G. Bill Fuller. He was one of the early pilots here. He also became the manager of Meacham Airport later in life and the seaplane base here. Meacham was established in 1925 and named Meacham Field in 1927. This gentleman is Ormer Locklear. Ormer was a local boy. He was pretty well known for being a hellraiser around the area, racing motorcycles up around through north side here. But he was also one of the first of the aviators that was trained here locally. If you saw the movie The Great Waldo Pepper, it's about barnstormers, and the lead barnstormer in that movie is Waldo Pepper, and it is a representation of Ormer Locklear. Ormer and a bunch of his friends, since they had a little bit of a flight experience, were asked to go out and experiment with airplanes and see what they could do. So they started to do things like fixing broken wheels on an airplane in flight, transferring fuel between one airplane and another. After a while, they became known as Ormer Locklear and the Lunatics and became the original barnstormers. going all around the area here in North Texas and all over Texas, putting on flight demonstrations for the people who would come in. They would give people rides in airplanes for $2, $3, whatever. After the war, a lot of these people wanted to continue flying. They'd had the experience of flight and they didn't want to lose it, so they bought airplane surplus from the military and started using them for other things. Ormer got into the movie business. He and one of his friends became movie flyers or stunt pilots for the movies in California. During his second filming, he and his partner were killed in an accident in Long Beach. They brought Ormer back here and he's buried at Greenwood Cemetery. The funeral for Ormer at the time, about 1925 I believe it was, when he was killed and they brought him back, there were about 50,000 people who lived here in Fort Worth, and 15 or 16,000 of them showed up for the funeral. But the other pilots continued on. They would take the airplanes, they would barnstorm around the country, they would fly over areas and throw these leaflets out that would let people know that they're going to be putting on flight demonstrations and give rides. People started calling those leaflets flyers because they'd go, oh look, flyers. And so that's where that name comes from for us today. But eventually they had to make money with this and to continue their profession. So they started up after the U.S. Postal Service started letting out contracts to deliver airmail around different regions. So a lot of these groups formed, these pilots formed into little small companies so that they could perform the airmail contracts that all came through here in Fort Worth. Amon Carter Sr. had seen that Fort Worth was designated as the airmail center for the entire Southwest. So any mail that went north or south through Texas or east or west through Texas had to come through Fort Worth. So a bunch of these little companies started to form. Colonial Air Transport, Colonial West Airways, Canadian Colonial, Robertson Aerial, Braniff, Continental Express, Central, North Central, Texas Air Transport. Texas Air Transport became one of these small companies that started to grow by acquiring these little groups all over Texas. Texas Air Transport, along with C.R. Smith and people like Amon Carter and Juan Tripp, formed Southern Air Transport and then eventually American Airways. So American Airways originally was based here, or one of its bases was here. A few years later, you'll notice in 1930 it was referred to as American Airways. In 34 it was called American Airlines. The reason for the name change 4 years later was something that was referred to as the Great Airmail Scandal. At that point in time, the manufacturers of airplanes also owned the airlines, also owned the contract airmail routes, and so the country started to look, or the government started to look at that as being monopolistic and wanted to break that up. So for a period of about 3 years, the U.S. Army Air Service flew the airmails. Then at the end of that time period, the government said no airline that had been operating under contracts before could do it again. So most of the major airlines here in the United States at that point in time simply changed their name, like American Airways. This item is a dirigible engine. It was built in 1922, 1923 by Wright Aircraft Company, and they were used in the dirigibles, a lot like the Hindenburg here. These engines were all in little pods on the outside of the airships, and mechanics were required to cross a little catwalk to go out to maintain these engines and make sure that they were oiled up and they kept running. The reason that engine is here, though, is because Fort Worth was the only helium plant in the entire world for a period of time. And so the giant Navy airships needed to refuel, and if they couldn't get the helium to go to them, they came through here in Fort Worth. The Shenandoah and the Los Angeles both came through here. This engine was one of the test cell engines for the Los Angeles. There were 3 of them built. We don't know where the other 2 are, but we know where this one is. And we've all talked about how much we'd like to see that thing run sometime to see what it sounds like. Fort Worth's development as an aircraft manufacturing organization, though, or area, started in about 1940. Reuben H. Fleet, who was the president of Consolidated Aircraft in San Diego, were in the process of building PBY flying boats for the British, and they had to get them cross-country and then cross the Atlantic. So they were looking for a place to rest the airplanes here in Texas. They didn't want to take them to the Gulf Coast because of the possibility of hurricanes. So Reuben H. Fleet sent a letter to Amon Carter and said, do you have a place where we can anchor and rest these boats? Amon took that letter to City Council, and 9 days later, Lake Worth was established as a seaplane base with 3 piers and moorings for all of these airplanes. We've got a picture here in the museum of about 24 of these flying boats that did not have landing gear at the time on the lake. From there in 1941, Air Force Plant Number 4 was built here to build B-24s for the Second World War. So we started building B-24s. Later in the war, we started building B-32s and then the B-36 towards the end of the war and after the war itself. Starting in about 1946 or so, we started to design the B-58 Hustler, and in 1950 we started production on those. The airplanes were here from 1950 until about 1970 when they stopped flying. The predecessor to, or the successor to the B-58 was the F-111. Low-level high-speed airplane where the B-58 had been designed as a high-level supersonic airplane, Mach 2 airplane. The F-111 was designed to be a low-level supersonic airplane. After that, they designed and continued to build F-36s, or F-16s rather. And then we've got the F-22s that were worked on here along with the F-35s of today. This cylinder shows all of the airplanes that have been built here in North Texas since 1940. It's over 69,000 airplanes, and the economic impact of the area is $1 trillion in today's dollars. So aviation has become a huge portion of the history and the heritage and the economy of North Texas. Today, 1 in 5 people who work here in the Metroplex are in aviation-related jobs. And aviation now, today, posts almost $40 billion a year to the economy here, with DFW being the biggest economic engine for aviation here. The rest of what we have here in the cases these are the airplanes that were flown here as part of the Air Force in this particular area. B-24s were here, B-29s were here, of course the B-36 and the KC-97s. We've got a TF-102 here, which is kind of interesting airplane. It was a trainer for the 102. The forward section of those airplanes were built here. They were then sent to San Diego where they were mated with the rest of the airplane. The airplanes were designed initially to be trainers for the 102 pilots so that they had a dual cockpit for the training process. They were also used as trainers for the B-58. And we have one of those models here. There were only 69 of them built. We have a TF-102 here, and we're proud to say it's a presidential airplane. George W. Bush flew that airplane 3 times when he was transitioning to the 102. Of course, the B-58s were built here, 116 of them, and also flew here. The T-33s were station airplanes, and the KC-135s and B-52s were all here. The F-105s and the F-4s were flown here by the 301st Air Force. F-111s were built here, and then we established Carswell later on as the JRB, or the Joint Reserve Base, in 1995. So we've got Marine Corps C-130s. We've got the Navy flies the C-4s, which are 737. We've got F-18s here. F-14s were here for a period of time, and of course the F-16s. Some of the other airplanes here are some of the airplanes that were designed here but may not have flown. For instance, the A-12. It was designed to be a replacement for the Navy's A-6 Intruder. It never flew. It never went into production. But what we do have is the original mock-up here. A small display on Major Horace Carswell, and this was the airplane he was flying in when he was killed in Southeast Asia. But he is here, and he is the namesake for the base for many years. These are some of the other experimental programs. These were all designed around the B-36 Peacemaker. Here's the F-111 and some of the variations on that, and then the F-16, which is maybe the most successful thing out of Fort Worth over the years that it's been developed here. Airplanes are being flown all over the world. And then we're back to the B-58 and our examples here of some of the items that pertain to the B-58 and its history here in Fort Worth in North Texas. So to continue on some of the aviation history here, it wasn't just Fort Worth that's built airplanes here. Bell Helicopter built, of the 69,000 airplanes, Bell Helicopters built almost 35,000 of them. But we also have contributions from Vought And from North American, these are some of the examples of the airplanes that were built over in Grand Prairie. The F-4U, the F-7 Cutlass, the F-8, and the A-7 were all built over there, along with some of the other missiles. This is just a varied collection of airplanes. Some of them have some pertinence to here in Fort Worth. This is about Bell. Bell, as I mentioned, has built 35,000 airplanes here. Mostly the Hueys and mostly the Cobras, but also a lot of Rangers, the OH-58s, and the Rangers that were used are still being used by police and fire and ambulance services. This is one of the favorite items here within the museum, and this is a T-38 trainer. The kids love to get in here. We put a helmet on them and they instantly become a pilot. We've got a video screen so that they can sit in the cockpit and see what it's like to do a low-level mission. And then we can help relate to the kids, because this is the identical cockpit to one of the airplanes that we have outside, which is an F-5 Tiger II, identical cockpit. So the kids really like to get in here. We put the helmet on them, and like I said, we give them little short lessons in what all the buttons, switches, and dials are here. But sometimes we get kids in here, and it's really hard to get them out. Part of the museum is twofold, and one of those is that we also have the Forward Air Controllers Museum here. Story of forward air control goes back to 1794 in Paris, France, with balloons. Now, forward air control is the function of a person on the ground or in the air controlling other assets to assist people on the ground in a function that's called close air support. So forward air controllers' jobs are to use other airplanes, naval gunfire, artillery to support friendlies on the ground. That started in 1794 in France. The French were under siege by the Prussians. Balloons were new at that point in time. The Montgolfier brothers had only introduced balloons 10 years earlier. And so although this is a pretty looking balloon, the balloons of the time, people didn't quite understand the dynamics of the balloon. And so they thought that the dirtier the fire that created the air that went up into the balloon, the better off it would be. So the balloons were sealed up with tar and wax. They were dirty, nasty, smelly devices, mostly considered to be spy devices. But one French general went up in one of the balloons to take a look at the battlefield. Once he got up there, he realized the vista that he had in front of him and started immediately writing notes to his generals, putting them in bottles and lowering them down on strings, and started to control his troops from the air. So that was what we consider to be the first incident of forward air control from the air. We can actually go back to the Chinese in about 800 BC with man-lifter kites, but there's a big gap, so we don't cover that. From there, forward air control has had a number of different aspects. Balloons were a big part of it for a long time, and we've come back to balloons now. But for instance, in the American Civil War, balloons were tethered to barges and put on rivers. And it was the first time that an artillery battery ever fired on a target that it couldn't see was during the American Civil War. They would use telegraphs from up in the balloons, and they would control the direction and the range of fire. So that's the first time that took place. Balloons were used in the Boer Wars. They were used in the Spanish-American Wars. Then there were airships that were used. Lots of different aspects of forward air control have developed over the years. So we cover all of that here, including the First World War and balloon pilots there. The first use of airplanes in warfare was for observation. They could go out and they could look and see. They quickly started putting cameras on airplanes so that they could take pictures of what they were seeing. And then within literally a few days from the point in time that they started to go out and observe the battlefield on the ground and taking pictures of the battlefield on the ground, they came back with small bombs, 4-pound bombs, and started using airplanes as bombers. So the first use of airplanes in the military service was as observation. Fighters were designed to shoot down observation airplanes. So we have a number of other things here. We consider the golden age of forward air control to be during the Vietnam era. There were so many airplanes that were put into the roles of forward air control, from the diminutive little O-1 Bird Dog up to the O-2 Skymaster, another Cessna product. The OV-10 Bronco, which was the namesake for our museum when we started up about 19 years ago, was the airplane that was designed to replace the O-1 Bird Dog. Twin-engine turboprop, capable of higher speed and being able to operate in a more safe environment. but also other airplanes were designed and used. We used rockets like these to mark the targets. Had white phosphorus rounds in the nose, so when they'd hit the ground, we'd get a big plume of white smoke, and that gave the forward air controller, or the FAC, the opportunity to then direct what was going on down on the ground. So all during Vietnam, numerous different airplanes, and we have those depicted here that were used during forward air control. Today, forward air control has become, in large part, a function of UAVs and drones. The Cobra helicopter, which was introduced in 1969, is still being used as a forward air control platform today. And that's the longest serving forward air control airplane of any type. But the drones, the UAVs, the Predators, the Global Hawks are all doing a lot of that now. Some of these things, this is our memorial plaque to members who have passed. And these are some of the trophies, if you will, that came out of the Vietnam era. This machine gun is a 1915 Chauchet. It's a French machine gun. The French introduced it to Southeast Asia, and it was still being used during Vietnam. This particular machine gun, which were considered to be the worst machine guns ever designed, was taken from the Ho Chi Minh Trail, where it was being used against American airplanes during Vietnam. So we go back to the First World War on that piece, which combines us with other things. But some of these others are essentially trophies that were brought back, or remembrances from that era.